As the COVID-19 pandemic continues on, Americans have a lot of questions about the vaccine and some uncertainty about the future.
Joining us to provide a lot of clarity to these questions is a man that many of you know. He's advised many presidents in fighting different battles against disease and is the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Thank you so much for joining us today, Doctor.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be with you.
Absolutely. Well, we've got a couple of questions, particularly about this new strain of COVID-19 that a lot of people have been talking about. That has been announced that's reportedly more contagious. First, why is that so much the case, and is it more deadly?
Well, the people who have the most experience with this mutant are the people in the UK, in England, because that is the dominant strain there. They've studied it extensively and tell us that although it's associated with a greater degree of transmissibility from person to person, on a person-by-person basis, it does not appear to be more virulent, which actually means it doesn't make you more sick or give you a greater chance of getting serious disease. What we're studying right now is whether that is the case. I mean, we have faith in our British colleagues, but we want to make sure, since we know that this virus is here in the United States, it's not the dominant virus. We want to know as much about it as we possibly can, including what impact it might have on the vaccines. Thus far, the Brits tell us it doesn't seem to be something that has eluded or escaping from the protection that is afforded by the vaccines that we're using. There are other mutants that are going on, such as some that are in South Africa that might be a little bit more concerning, but these are the kind of things that you take seriously and you follow them very, very carefully, which is what we are doing.
And are there any difference in symptoms of the new variant and the original or novel coronavirus? And are there clear differences between it and that original strain?
No, there doesn't appear to be any difference in the type of disease that people get from this particular virus. The disease manifestations, both the early presenting signs and symptoms, as well as the advanced type of diseases for those people who do develop the severe form of COVID-19. As you well know, that maybe close to 40 to 50% of people, 40 to 45% of people don't have any symptoms. And those who do generally have mild symptoms, but there is a group of individuals, about 20 to 25% of the people who develop symptoms can go on to very severe disease. But it doesn't appear to be any difference, at least from what we hear from our British colleagues. This mutant is in such a low level in the United States thus far, and again, we're following it very carefully, that it's impossible for us to make a comparison at this time.
Dr. Fauci, millions of Americans have gotten the vaccine, but of course we've got a long way to go. What is the projected timeline for getting the general population vaccinated, and how many vaccines do we need to administer before returning to quote-unquote normal?
Well, those are a couple of questions that are excellent questions. So first of all, the one thing we need to appreciate is that we've got to make sure that we overcome this vaccine hesitancy that we see in certain individuals who are reluctant or hesitant to get vaccinated. Because in order to get to a point where we feel that we're starting to approach normality, we generally refer to that as herd immunity, namely enough people in the country are vaccinated that there's kind of a blanket of protection against or for society against the virus. The estimates, and these are pure estimates, but I think they'll turn out to be close to being accurate, but we'll know, after we get more experience, is that the estimate is that somewhere between 70 and 85% of the population needs to be vaccinated before you can feel that you're starting to get that kind of herd immunity that protects the entire society. If we do a good job logistically in getting people vaccinated, hopefully, after we convince the overwhelming majority of the people to get vaccinated, that we can attain that sometime as we get into the summer, namely mid to late summer, so that by the time we get to the fall, we will have that umbrella of protection over us. But that's going to be completely contingent on our success in getting the overwhelming majority of the people vaccinated.
Dr. Fauci, have you seen or heard of Joe Biden's plan for battling the pandemic? What does it look like, and how is it different from what we're currently doing?
Well, I'm going to leave that to the president-elect to make those kinds of announcements. I don't want to get ahead of him. We have discussed it with the Biden team, but I'm going to leave that to the president-elect, who almost certainly will shortly be letting you know about that.
Will fully reopening the country start state by state? That's a lot of big questions that people have, or is this more of a federal decision when it comes to those matters?
No, as you well know, the way things have gone over the past several months is that a lot of the individual decisions and discretion have been left to the states. I think, apropos of your prior question, you'll probably see a considerable amount of interaction, exchange of information and support between the federal government and the states. But the states, since each state has, some commonalities, but also differences depending where you are in the country, the climate, the number of people in the state, the density of the population, all of those things will come into the decision about what any individual state might do.
And Dr. Fauci, the WHO is heading to China, right, to try and find the origin of the virus. What do you hope they find, and what are they looking for?
Well, obviously, when you have the emergence of a brand new infection such as this, which has caused such global devastation, you want to find out what the origin, how did that happen? The obvious thing, if it is anything like SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, which we saw come about in 2002, it was felt to be a jumping of species from an animal reservoir, from a bat to a civet cat, which is an animal that is served at ceremonial feasts in China, that's how we got that infection that originated in the Guangdong province of China. Also, MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, another coronavirus, was felt to go from a bat to a camel to human. So we really need to know what the origin of this was. What was it, an animal species that it jumped from? And if so, when and how?
Yeah, and you kind of just touched on this in the previous question, and this is kind of a two-part question here for you. What do you wish we as a country would have done differently to battle this pandemic? And do you believe political struggle between parties hurt our response to the virus? We saw Twitter spats between Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker and President Trump, causing some to believe that some lawmakers were making COVID a political issue, causing more lives to be lost.
Well, I'm not going to comment about any specific person or entity politically, but I can tell you something generally that could help to answer your question. I think anybody who's been watching what goes on realizes that we in our country, unfortunately, are living in a very divisive period, extremely divisive, to the point that it has led to the kind of violence that we saw last week. That is very troubling. When you're trying to address a global pandemic that's throughout our own country has devastated to the point of having really unprecedented deaths, hospitalizations, the worst we've seen in 102 years since the 1918 influenza pandemic, that when you have divisiveness and things get mixed up with political ideologies, that is never a good thing when you're trying to fight a pandemic. Everybody needs to be pulling together. So if there's anything we could have done differently, is that lay aside political or ideological differences and all get on the same page to realize that we're all in this together, and the only way we're going to get out of it is by getting out of it together as a unified nation.
Dr. Fauci, last question for you. More of a personal question. How has the pandemic impacted you personally? Obviously, being the face behind this battle has its challenges, I can imagine.
Well, it certainly has completely consumed my life. I can tell you something, not needing any sympathy about it, but it's the truth. I haven't had a day off since last January, namely January of 2020. So it's been something that I feel we need to do because the enormity of the problem requires 24/7. And that's what I and many of my colleagues have given to it 24/7. So it's been exhausting. The thing about it that has underscored this divisiveness that we're talking about is that I've experienced what some others have is threats upon my life and harassment of my family, including my wife and my children, by people who disagree with my public health message. Now, try to get your arms around that one, that when you disagree with someone's public health message, you actually threaten their life. That's no way to contain an outbreak when people feel so strongly about things that they let a public health message trigger that kind of response.
Well, we thank you for your transparency there and openness, and thank you for your time and spending it with us today and sharing that insight into some of America's most frequently asked questions about the pandemic.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci.
Good to be with you. Thank you for having me.